Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom. Written by Cory Doctorow. Read by Mark Douglas Nelson. Prologue. I lived long enough to see the cure for death, to see the rise of the Bitchin' Society, to learn 10 languages, to compose 3 symphonies, to realize my boyhood dream of taking up residence in Disney World, to see the death of the workplace and of work. I never thought I'd live to see the day when Keep-A-Movin' Dan would decide to deadhead until the heat death of the universe. Dan was in his second or third blush of youth when I first met him, sometime late 21. He was a rangy cowpoke, apparent 25 or so, all rawhide squint lines and sunburned neck, boots worn thin and infinitely comfortable. I was in the middle of my chem thesis, my 4th doctorate, and he was taking a break from saving the world, chilling on campus in Toronto and core dumping for some poor anthro major. We hooked up at the Grad Students' Union, the GSU, or Gazoo for those who knew, on a busy Friday night, springish. I was fighting a choral slow battle for a stool at the scratched bar, inching my way closer every time the press of bodies shifted, and he had one of the few seats, surrounded by a litter of cigarette junk and empties, clearly encamped. Some duration into my foray, he cocked his head at me and raised a sun-bleached eyebrow. "You get any closer, son, and we're going to have to get a prenup." I was apparent 40 or so, and I thought about bridling at being called son, but I looked into his eyes and decided that he had enough real time that he could call me son any time he wanted. I backed off a little and apologized. He struck a cig and blew a pungent, strong plume over the bartender's head. "Don't worry about it. I'm probably a little over-accustomed to personal space." I could remember the last time I'd heard anyone on-world talk about personal space. With the mortality rate at 0 and the birth rate at non-zero, the world was inexorably accreting a dense carpet of people, even with the migratory and deadhead drains on the population. "You've been jaunting?" I asked. His eyes were too sharp for him to have missed an instant's experience to deadheading. He chuckled. "No, sir, not me. I'm into the kind of macho shitheadery that you only come across on-world. Jaunting's for play. I need work." The bar glass tinkled a counterpoint. I took a moment to conjure a HUD with his woofy score on it. I had to resize the window. He had too many zeros to fit on my standard display. I tried to act cool, but he caught the upwards flick of my eyes and then their involuntary widening. He tried a little all-shucksery, gave it up, and let a prideful grin show. "I try not to pay it much mind. Some people, they get overly grateful." He must have seen my eyes flick up again to pull his woofy history. "Wait, don't go doing that. I'll tell you about it. You really got to know. Damn, it's so easy to get used to life without hyperlinks. You think you'd really miss 'em, but you don't." And it clicked for me. He was a missionary, one of those fringe dwellers who act as emissary from the Bitchin' Society to the benighted corners of the world where, for whatever reasons, they want to die, starve, and choke on petrochem waste. It's amazing that these communities survive more than a generation. In the Bitchin' Society proper, we usually outlive our detractors. The missionaries don't have such a high success rate. You have to be awfully convincing to get through to a culture that's already successfully resisted nearly a century's worth of propaganda. But when you convert a whole village, you accrue all the woofy they have to give. More often, missionaries end up getting refreshed from a backup after they aren't heard from for a decade or so. I'd never met one in the flesh before. "How many successful missions have you had?" I asked. "Figured it out, huh? I've just come off my 5th in 20 years. Counter-revolutionaries hidden out in the old Cheyenne Mountain NORAD site, still there a generation later." He sandpapered his whiskers with his fingertips. "Their parents went to ground after their life savings vanished, and they had no use for tech any more advanced than a rifle. Plenty of those, though." He spun a fascinating yarn then, how he slowly gained the acceptance of the mountain dwellers, and then their trust, and then betrayed it in subtle, beneficent ways. Introducing free energy to their greenhouses, then a engineered crop or two, then curing a couple deaths, slowly inching them toward the Bitchin' Society, until they couldn't remember why they hadn't wanted to be a part of it from the start. Now they were mostly off-world, exploring toy frontiers with unlimited energy and unlimited supplies, and deadheading through the dull times en route. "I guess it'd be too much of a shock for them to stay on-world. They think of us as the enemy, you know. They had all kinds of plans drawn up for when we invaded them and took them away. Hollow suicide teeth, booby traps, fallback and rendezvous points for the survivors. They just can't get over hating us, even though we don't even know they exist. Off-world, they can pretend that they're still living rough and hard." He rubbed his chin again, his hard calluses grating over his whiskers. "But for me, the real rough life is right here, on-world. The little enclaves, each one is like an alternate history of humanity. What if we'd taken the free energy, but not deadheading? What if we'd taken deadheading, but only for the critically ill, not for people who didn't want to be bored on long bus rides? Or no hyperlinks, no adhocracy, no woofy. Each one is different and wonderful." I have a stupid habit of arguing for the sake of, and I found myself saying, "Wonderful? Oh, sure, nothing finer than, let's see, dying, starving, freezing, broiling, killing, cruelty and ignorance and pain and misery. I know I sure miss it." Keep a Movin' Dan snorted. "You think a junkie misses sobriety?" I knocked on the bar. "Hello, there aren't any junkies anymore." He struck another cig. "But you know what a junkie is, right? Junkies don't miss sobriety because they don't remember how sharp everything was, how the pain made the joy sweeter. We can't remember what it was like to work to earn our keep, to worry that there might not be enough, that we might get sick or hit by a bus. We don't remember what it was like to take chances, and we sure as shit don't remember what it felt like to have them pay off." He had a point. Here I was, only in my second or third adulthood, and already ready to toss it all in and do something, anything else. He had a point, but I wasn't about to admit it. "So you say. I say I take a chance when I strike up a conversation in a bar, when I fall in love. And what about the deadheads? 2 people I know, they just went deadhead for 10,000 years. Tell me that's not taking a chance." Truth be told, almost everyone I'd known in my 80-some years were deadheading or jaunting or just gone. Lonely days, then. "Brother, that's committing half-ass suicide. The way we're going, they'll be lucky if someone doesn't just switch 'em off when it comes time to reanimate. In case you haven't noticed, it's getting a little crowded around here." I made pish-posh sounds and wiped off my forehead with a bar napkin. The gazoo was beastly hot on summer nights. "Uh-huh. Just like the world was getting a little crowded 100 years ago, before free energy. Like it was getting too greenhousey, too nuky, too hot or too cold. We fixed it then, we'll fix it again when the time comes. I'm gonna be here in 10,000 years, you damn betcha, but I think I'll do it the long way around." He cocked his head again and gave it some thought. If it had been any of the other grad students, I'd have assumed he was grepping for some bolstering factoids to support his next sally. But with him, I just knew he was thinking about it the old-fashioned way. "I think that if I'm still here in 10,000 years, I'm going to be crazy as hell. 10,000 years, pal. 10,000 years ago, the state of the art was a goat. You really think you're going to be anything recognizably human in 100 centuries? Me, I'm not interested in being a post-person. I'm going to wake up one day and I'm going to say, 'Well, I guess I've seen about enough,' and that'll be my last day." I had seen where he was going with this, and I had stopped paying attention while I readied my response. I probably should have paid more attention. But why? Why not just deadhead for a few centuries, see if there's anything that takes your fancy, and if not, back to sleep for a few more? Why do anything so final? He embarrassed me by making a show of thinking it over again, making me feel like I was just a half-pissed glib poltroon. "I suppose it's because nothing else is. I've always known that someday I was going to stop moving, stop seeking, stop kicking, and have done with it. There'll come a day when I don't have anything left to do except stop." On campus, they called him Keep-A-Movin' Dan because of his cowboy vibe and because of his lifestyle, and he somehow grew to take over every conversation I had for the next 6 months. I pinged his woofie a few times and noticed that it was climbing steadily upward as he accumulated more esteem from the people he met. I'd pretty much pissed away most of my woofie, all the savings from the symphonies and the first 3 theses, drinking myself stupid at the gazoo, hogging library terminals, pestering profs, until I'd expended all the respect anyone had ever afforded me. All except Dan, who, for some reason, stood me to regular beers and meals and movies. I got to feeling like I was someone special. Not everyone had a chum as exotic as Keep-A-Movin' Dan, the legendary missionary who visited the only places left that were closed to the Bitchin' Society. I can't say for sure why he hung around with me. He mentioned once or twice that he'd liked my symphonies, and he'd read my ergonomics thesis on applying theme park crowd control techniques in urban settings, and liked what I had to say there. But I think it came down to us having a good time needling each other. I talked to him about the vast carpet of the future unrolling before us, of the certainty that we would encounter alien intelligences someday, of the unimaginable frontiers open to each of us. He'd tell me that deadheading was a strong indicator that one's personal reservoir of introspection and creativity was dry, and that without struggle there is no real victory. This was a good fight, one we could have 1,000 times without resolving. I'd get him to concede that woofie recaptured the true essence of money. In the old days, if you were broke but respected, you wouldn't starve. Contrariwise, if you were rich and hated, no sum could buy you security and peace. By measuring the thing that money really represented, your personal capital with your friends and neighbors, you more accurately gauged your success. And then he'd lead me down a subtle, carefully baited trail that led to my allowing that, while, yes, we might someday encounter alien species with wild and fabulous ways, that right now there was a slightly depressing homogeneity to the world. On a fine spring day, I defended my thesis to 2 embodied humans and 1 prof whose body was out for an overhaul, whose consciousness was present via speakerphone from the computer where it was resting. They all liked it. I collected my sheepskin and went out hunting for Dan in the sweet, flower-stinking streets. He'd gone. The anthro major he'd been torturing with his war stories said that they'd wrapped up that morning and he'd headed to the walled city of Tijuana to take his shot with the descendants of a platoon of U.S. Marines who'd settled there and cut themselves off from the Bitchin' Society. So I went to Disney World. In deference to Dan, I took the flight in real time, in the minuscule cabin reserved for those of us who stubbornly refused to be frozen and stacked like cordwood for the 2-hour flight. I was the only one taking the trip in real time, but a flight attendant dutifully served me a urine sample-sized orange juice and a rubbery, pungent cheese omelet. I stared out the windows at the infinite clouds while the autopilot banked around the turbulence, and wondered when I'd see Dan next. Chapter 1. My girlfriend was 15% of my age, and I was old-fashioned enough that it bugged me. Her name was Lil, and she was second-generation Disney World, her parents being among the original adhocracy that took over the management of Liberty Square and Tom Sawyer Island. She was, quite literally, raised in Walt Disney World, and it showed. It showed. She was neat and efficient in her every little thing, from her shining red hair to her careful accounting of each gear and cog in the animatronics that were in her charge. Her folks were in canopic jars in Kissimmee, deadheading for a few centuries. On a muggy Wednesday, we dangled our feet over the edge of the Liberty Bells riverboat pier, watching the listless Confederate flag over Fort Langhorne on Tom Sawyer Island by moonlight. The Magic Kingdom was all closed up, and every last guest had been chased out the gate underneath the Main Street train station, and we were able to breathe a heavy sigh of relief, shuck parts of our costumes, and relax together while the cicadas sang. I was more than a century old, but there was still a kind of magic in having my arm around the warm, fine shoulders of a girl by moonlight, hidden from the hustle of the cleaning teams by the turnstiles, breathing the warm, moist air. Lil plumped her head against my shoulder and gave me a butterfly kiss under my jaw. "Her name was McGill," I sang gently. "But she called herself Lil," she sang, warm breath on my collarbones. "And everyone knew her as Nancy," I sang. I'd been startled to know that she knew the Beatles. They'd been old news in my youth, after all. But her parents had given her a thorough, if eclectic, education. "Want to do a walkthrough?" she asked. It was one of her favorite duties, exploring every inch of the rides in her care with the lights on, after the horde of tourists had gone. We both liked to see the underpinnings of the magic. Maybe that's why I kept picking at the relationship. "I'm a little pooped. Let's sit a while longer, if you don't mind." She heaved a dramatic sigh. "Oh, all right, old man." She reached up and gently tweaked my nipple, and I gave a satisfying little jump. I think the age difference bothered her, too, though she teased me for letting it get to me. "I think I'll be able to manage a totter through the haunted mansion if you just give me a moment to rest my bursitis." I felt her smile against my shirt. She loved the mansion, loved to turn on the ballroom ghosts and dance their waltz with them on the dusty floor, loved to try and stare down the marble busts in the library that followed your gaze as you passed. I liked it too, but I really liked just sitting there with her, watching the water and the trees. I was getting ready to go when I heard a soft ping inside my cochlea. "Damn," I said. "I've got a call." "Tell them you're busy," she said. "I will," I said, and answered the call subvocally. "Julius here." "Hi, Julius. It's Dan. You got a minute?" I knew 1,000 Dans, but I recognized the voice immediately, though it had been 10 years since we last got drunk at the Gazoo together. I muted the subvocal and said, "Lil, I've got to take this. Do you mind?" "Oh, no, not at all," she sarcasmed at me. She sat up and pulled out her crack pipe and lit up. "Dan," I subvocalized, "long time no speak." "Yeah, buddy, it sure has been," he said, and his voice cracked on a sob. I turned and gave Lil such a look she dropped her pipe. "How can I help?" she said, softly but swiftly. I waved her off and switched the phone to full vocal mode. My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the cricket-punctuated calm. "Where are you at, Dan?" I asked. "Down here in Orlando. I'm stuck out on Pleasure Island." "All right," I said. "Meet me at, the Adventurers Club, upstairs on the couch by the door. I'll be there in—" I shot a look at Lil, who knew the cast member-only roads better than I. She flashed 10 fingers at me. 10 minutes. "Okay," he said. "Sorry." He had his voice back under control. I switched off. "What's up?" Lil asked. "I'm not sure. An old friend is in town. He sounds like he's got a problem." Lil pointed a finger at me and made a trigger-squeezing gesture. "There," she said. "I've just dumped the best route to Pleasure Island in your public directory. Keep me in the loop, okay?" I set off for the utilidor entrance near the Hall of Presidents and booted down the stairs to the hum of the underground tunnel system. I took the slidewalk to cast parking and zipped my little cart out to Pleasure Island. I found Dan sitting on the L-shaped couch underneath rows of faked-up trophy shots with humorous captions. Downstairs, cast members were working the animatronic masks and idols, chattering with the guests. Dan was apparent 50-plus, a little paunchy and stubbled. He had raccoon mask bags under his eyes, and he slumped listlessly. As I approached, I pinged his woofie, and was startled to see that it had dropped to nearly 0. "Jesus," I said, as I sat down next to him. "You look like hell, Dan." He nodded. "Appearances can be deceptive," he said, "but in this case, they're bang on." "You want to talk about it?" I asked. "Somewhere else, huh? I hear they ring in the New Year every night at midnight. I think that'd be a little too much for me right now." I led him out to my cart and cruised back to my place I shared with Lil, out in Kissimmee. He smoked 8 cigarettes on the 20-minute ride, hammering one after another into his mouth, filling my runabout with stinging clouds. I kept glancing at him in the rear view. He had his eyes closed, and in repose he looked dead. I could hardly believe that this was my vibrant action hero pal of yore. Surreptitiously, I called Lil's phone. "I'm bringing him home," I subvocalized. "He's in rough shape. Not sure what it's all about." "I'll make up the couch," she said, "and get some coffee together. Love you." "Back at you, kid," I said. As we approached the tacky little sway-backed ranch house, he opened his eyes. "You're a pal, Jules." I waved him off. "No, really. I tried to think of who I could call, and you were the only one. I've missed you, bud." "Lil said she put some coffee on," I said. "You sound like you need it." Lil was waiting on the sofa, a folded blanket and an extra pillow on the side table, a pot of coffee and some Disneyland Beijing mugs beside them. She stood and extended her hand. "I'm Lil," she said. "Dan," he said. "It's a pleasure." I knew she was pinging his woofie, and I caught her look of surprised disapproval. Us oldsters who predate woofie know that it's important, but to the kids, it's the world. Someone without any is automatically suspect. I watched her recover quickly, smile, and surreptitiously wipe her hand on her jeans. "Coffee?" she said. "Oh yeah," Dan said, and slumped on the sofa. She poured him a cup and set it on a coaster on the coffee table. "I'll let you boys catch up then," she said, and started for the bedroom. "No," Dan said. "Wait, if you don't mind. I think it'd help if I could talk to someone younger, too." She set her face in the look of chirpy helpfulness that all the second-gen cast members have at their instant disposal and settled into an armchair. She pulled out her pipe and lit a rock. I went through my crack period before she was born, just after they made it decaf, and I always felt old when I saw her and her friends light up. Dan surprised me by holding out a hand to her and taking the pipe. He toked heavily, then passed it back. Dan closed his eyes again, then ground his fists into them, sipped his coffee. It was clear he was trying to figure out where to start. "I believed that I was braver than I really am, is what it boils down to," he said. "Who doesn't?" I said. "I really thought I could do it. I knew that someday I'd run out of things to do, things to see. I knew that I'd finish someday. You remember, we used to argue about it. I swore I'd be done, and that would be the end of it. And now I am. There isn't a single place left on world that isn't part of the Bitchin' Society. There isn't a single thing left that I want any part of." "So, deadhead for a few centuries," I said. "Put the decision off." "No!" he shouted, startling both of us. "I'm done. It's over." "So do it," Lil said. "I can't," he sobbed, and buried his face in his hands. He cried like a baby, in great, snoring sobs that shook his whole body. Lil went into the kitchen and got some tissue and passed it to me. I sat alongside him and awkwardly patted his back. "Jesus," he said into his palms. "Jesus." "Dan?" I said quietly. He sat up and took the tissue, wiped off his face and hands. "Thanks," he said. "I've tried to make a go of it. Really, I have. I've spent the last 8 years in Istanbul, writing papers on my missions, about the communities. I did some follow-up studies, interviews. No one was interested, not even me. I smoked a lot of hash. It didn't help. So, one morning, I woke up and went to the bazaar and said goodbye to the friends I'd made there. Then I went to a pharmacy and had the man make me up a lethal injection. He wished me good luck, and I went back to my rooms. I sat there with the hypo all afternoon. Then I decided to sleep on it, and I got up the next morning and I did it all over again. I looked inside myself, and I saw that I didn't have the guts. I just didn't have the guts. I've stared down the barrels of 100 guns, had 1,000 knives pressed up against my throat, but I didn't have the guts to press that button." "You were too late," Lil said. We both turned to look at her. "You were a decade too late. Look at you. You're pathetic. If you killed yourself right now, you'd just be a washed-up loser who couldn't hack it. If you'd done it 10 years earlier, you'd have been going out on top, a champion, retiring permanently." She set her mug down with a harder-than-necessary clunk. Sometimes Lil and I are right on the same wavelength. Sometimes it's like she's on a different planet. All I could do was sit there, horrified, and she was happy to discuss the timing of my pal's suicide. But she was right. Dan nodded heavily, and I saw that he knew it too. "A day late, a dollar short," he sighed. "Well, don't just sit there," she said. "You know what you've got to do." "What?" I said, involuntarily irritated by her tone. She looked at me like I was being deliberately stupid. "He's got to get back on top, cleaned up, dried out, into some productive work. Get that woofie up, too. Then he can kill himself with dignity." It was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard. Dan, though, was cocking an eyebrow at her and thinking hard. "How old did you say you were?" he asked. 23, she said. "Wish I'd had your smarts at 23, he said, and heaved a sigh, straightening up. "Can I stay here while I get the job done?" I looked askance at Lil, who considered for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, pal, sure," I said. I clapped him on the shoulder. "You look beat." "Beat doesn't begin to cover it," he said. "Good night, then," I said. Chapter 2. Adhocracy works well for the most part. Lil's folks had taken over the running of Liberty Square with a group of other interested, compatible souls. They did a fine job, racked up gobs of woofie, and anyone who came around and tried to take it over would be so reviled by the guests they wouldn't find a pot to piss in. Or they'd have such a wicked, radical approach that they'd ouster Lil's parents and their pals and do a better job. And break down, though. There were pretenders to the throne, a group who'd worked with the original adhocracy and then had moved off to other pursuits. Some of them had gone to school, some of them had made movies, written books, or gone off to Disneyland Beijing to help start things up. A few had deadheaded for a couple of decades. They came back to Liberty Square with a message: update the attractions. The Liberty Square adhocs were the staunchest conservatives in the Magic Kingdom, preserving the wheezing technology in the face of a park that changed almost daily. The newcomer old-timers were on side with the rest of the park, had their support, and looked like they might make a successful go of it. So it fell to Lil to make sure that there were no bugs in the meager attractions of Liberty Square, the Hall of the Presidents, the Liberty Bell riverboat, and the glorious Haunted Mansion, arguably the coolest attraction to come from the fevered minds of the old-time Disney Imagineers. I caught her backstage at the Hall of Presidents, tinkering with Lincoln 2, the backup animatronic. Lil tried to keep 2 of everything running at speed, just in case. She could swap out a dead bot for a backup in 5 minutes flat, which is all that crowd control would permit. It had been 2 weeks since Dan's arrival, and though I'd barely seen him in that time, his presence was vivid in our lives. Our little ranch house had a new smell, not unpleasant, of rejuve and hope and loss, something barely noticeable over the tropical flowers nodding in front of our porch. My phone rang 3 or 4 times a day, Dan checking in from his rounds of the park, seeking out some way to accumulate personal capital. His excitement and dedication to the task were inspiring, pulling me into his over-the-top and damn-the-torpedoes mode of being. "You just missed Dan," she said. She had her head in Lincoln's chest, working with an auto-solder and a magnifier. Bent over, red hair tied back in a neat bun, sweat sheening her wiry freckled arms, smelling of girl sweat and machine lubricant, she made me wish there were a mattress somewhere backstage. I settled for patting her behind affectionately, and she wriggled appreciatively. "He's looking better." His rejuve had taken him back to apparent 25, the way I remember him. He was raw-boned and leathery, but still had the defeated stoop that had startled me when I saw him at the Adventurers Club. "What did he want?" "He's been hanging out with Deborah. He wanted to make sure I knew what she's up to." Deborah was one of the old guard, a former comrade of Lil's parents. She'd spent a decade in Disneyland Beijing, coding sim rides. If she had her way, we'd tear down every marvelous Rube Goldberg in the park and replace them with pristine, white sim boxes on giant articulated servos. The problem was, she was really good at coding sims. Her great movie ride rehab at MGM was breathtaking. The Star Wars sequence had already inspired 100 fan sites that fielded millions of hits. She leveraged her success into a deal with the Adventureland adhocs to rehab the Pirates of the Caribbean, and their backstage areas were piled high with reference: treasure chests and cutlasses and bowsprits. It was terrifying to walk through. The Pirates was the last ride Walt personally supervised, and we thought it was sacrosanct. But Deborah had built a pirate sim in Beijing, based on Chen Ai Sao, the 19th-century Chinese pirate queen, which was credited with rescuing the park from obscurity and ruin. The Florida iteration would incorporate the best aspects of its Chinese cousin, the AI-driven sims that communicated with each other and with the guests, greeted them by name each time they rode, and spinning age-appropriate tales of piracy on the high seas. The spectacular fly-through of the aquatic necropolis of rotting junks on the seafloor, the thrilling pitch and yaw of the Sim as it weathered a violent, breathtaking storm, but with Western themes. Wafts of Jamaican pepper sauce crackling through the air, liquid Afro-Caribbean accents, and sword fights conducted in the manner of the pirates who plied the blue waters of the New World. Identical Sims would be stacked like cordwood in the space currently occupied by the bulky ride apparatus and dioramas, quintupling capacity and halving load time. So, what's she up to? Lil extracted herself from the rail splitter's mechanical guts and made a comical moue of worry. She's rehabbing the pirates, and doing an incredible job. They're ahead of schedule, they've got good net buzz, the focus groups are coming themselves. The comedy went out of her expression, bearing genuine worry. She turned away and closed up Honest Abe, then fired her finger at him. Smoothly, he began to run through his spiel, silent but for the soft hum and whine of his servos. Lil mimed twiddling a knob, and his audio track kicked in low. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined could not, by force, make a track on the Blue Ridge, nor take a drink from the Ohio. If destruction be our lot, then we ourselves must be its author, and its finisher. She mimed turning down the gain, and he fell silent again. You said it, Mr. President, she said, and fired her finger at him again, powering him down. She bent and adjusted his hand-sewn period topcoat, then carefully wound and set the turnip watch in his vest pocket. I put my arm around her shoulders. You're doing all you can, and it's good work, I said. I'd fallen into the easy cast member mode of speaking, voicing bland affirmations. Hearing the words, I felt a flush of embarrassment. I pulled her into a long, hard hug and fumbled for better reassurance. Finding no words that would do, I gave her a final squeeze and let her go. She looked at me sidelong and nodded her head. It'll be fine, of course, she said. I mean, the worst possible scenario is that Deborah will do her job very, very well and make things even better than they are now. That's not so bad. This was a 180-degree reversal of her position on the subject the last time we'd talked, but you don't live more than a century without learning when to point out that sort of thing and when not to. My cochlea struck 12 noon, and a HUD appeared with my weekly backup reminder. Lil was maneuvering Ben Franklin II out of his niche. I waved goodbye at her back and walked away to an uplink terminal. Once I was close enough for secure broadband communications, I got ready to back up. My cochlea chimed again, and I answered it. Yes, I subvocalized impatiently. I hated getting distracted from a backup. One of my enduring fears was that I'd forget the backup altogether and leave myself vulnerable for an entire week until the next reminder. I'd lost the knack of getting into habits in my adolescence, giving in completely to machine-generated reminders over conscious choice. It's Dan! I heard the sound of the park in full swing behind him. Children's laughter, bright, recorded animatronic spiels, the tromp of 1,000 feet. Can you meet me at the Tiki Room? It's pretty important. Can it wait for 15? I asked. Sure. See you in 15. I rung off and initiated the backup. A status bar zipped across a HUD, dumping the parts of my memory that were purely digital. Then it finished and started in on organic memory. My eyes rolled back in my head, and my life flashed before my eyes. Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, copyright 2003 by Cory Doctorow. For more information, visit his website at www.craphound.com. For more free science fiction, horror, and fantasy audiobooks, visit scipodbooks.com. That's SCI Podbooks. Thanks for listening.